Welcome to Eagles, Globes, and Anchors, the strategically minded podcast of the Marine Corps War College, covering the intersection of strategy, security, and warfare.
Welcome to Eagles, Globes, and Anchors, the strategically minded podcast of Marine Corps University. Today we're discussing the first graphic novel ever selected for the Commandant's professional reading list, The White Donkey. My guest today is Terminal Lance himself, Maximilian Uriarte. I think I just butchered that. He's going to correct me. Max is an artist living in Los Angeles, California. He's an Oregon native and enlisted in the Marine Corps back in 2006 at the age of 19. He deployed to Iraq twice in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. While still on active duty, he created the hit webcomic Terminal Lance, which many of you have probably read in the Marine Corps Times or online. And then in 2016, Max published The White Donkey, Terminal Lance, which tells the story of a young Marine's deployment to Iraq and the challenges he faced. Max, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I had my name plastered on my chest for 4 years, and nobody ever was able to pronounce it correctly. It's technically Uriarte, which is Spanish, Mexican name.
Which is it sounds lovely. It just is melodious. I like it.
It sounds lovely when it's said right. But, when I was enlisted, I always knew, in the morning they would do roll call. And I always knew, when they were getting to my name. Because, it'd be like Thompson, Thomas, and then they would just stop, stare at the paper. Staff sergeant would just be staring at the paper. And he just would have no idea how to continue. Just go, and I'm like, I'm right here. I'm right here. Don't hurt yourself, please. So it was always a hassle.
Well, we appreciate you being on the podcast. Before we get into the discussion of White Donkey, though, I glossed over most of your background. If you could tell our listeners a little bit more about what brought you into the graphic novel genre, or what brought you into the idea of a comic to begin with, what motivated you to launch Terminal Lance. Was it just something that you did as a personal outlet that kind of went viral, or were you trying to speak through the comic itself?
I think it's kind of both, right? So I, as you had mentioned, I enlisted in 2006, and I went to Iraq in 2007 and 8, and then went back again in 2009. And so Terminal Lance was something that I actually came up with right after my first deployment. So it's like around 2008-ish or early 2009. I had actually always wanted to do a web comic, in general. Even before I enlisted, this was just something that I had been interested in doing. And I had an idea for a zombie thing. That's really into zombie stuff. This is before I enlisted when I was 18. And, but nothing ever really got off the ground. It's hard, when you're starting with nothing and you have to make your own website and everything, and those tools weren't really available. But so I kicked around the idea of Terminal Lance really early in 2008 and 9. They ultimately didn't end up taking off. But then when I came back from Iraq in 2009, around the end of the year, I think I came back in September-ish, I came home and I was like, I'm getting out soon, and I want to do this thing. I want to make a comic strip about the Marine Corps, because I found that there were some funny comics and stuff. Not to name names, there are some comics about the Marine Corps, but I felt like they didn't really capture the kind of authentic misery of the Marines that I was surrounded by, like myself and other Lance Corporals that had been to Iraq, etc. I found that these other comics or these other sort of funny little cute Marine Corps things were very celebratory in a way. And when I looked around myself and how a lot of the Lance Corporals around me felt, it was like nobody wanted to be here. Everybody just kind of wanted to go home. So I wanted to capture that misery of being enlisted and speaking more of a truth to the experience of being enlisted, and having something that I could create, as you said, for my own catharsis. I think that it actually, I can talk about this a little bit more later, but I think creating Terminal Lance and doing Terminal Lance through my own transition out of the Marine Corps really helped me look at it and examine it and make sense of my own experience in a way that I got other people to laugh with me and share that transition out. That's a really tough thing, getting out of the Marine Corps and adapting to being a civilian again. And yeah, I've been an artist my whole life. Since I was 3 years old, I've been drawing and painting, and I had classically trained myself a lot before I enlisted. And then when I got out, I used my GI Bill to go to art school. So that was really great. And, so art and drawing is something that I've always just loved doing. And to me, my practice is about visual storytelling. I love telling stories, but I love to do it visually because I'm a very visual guy. And so that marriage of imagery and story is I think, my bread and butter and my specialty of profession. So that's why I decided to go with comics, the visual storytelling medium.
Well, and I think it resonated with not just Marines, but with the broader public as well. I think there were probably a lot of brothers and sisters and parents and aunts and uncles who maybe felt like they could connect better to their loved one's military experience via your comic, because it was helping them to see a Marine experience that maybe their loved one wouldn't vocalize to them as a family member, not a Marine, but maybe a vicarious attachment as well. Because I think you're very popular, not just with uniform personnel. You also seem to be very popular with family of uniform personnel or friends of uniform personnel. And I wonder if that's part of the connection.
What I love about doing Terminal Lance is seeing how many people really resonate with it, and including the White Donkey. I get emails all the time from people that are, they're like, I love the emails that are from family and friends, right? Like I get stuff from, Marine spouses, from the guys that are like, oh, my dad was in the Marine Corps 20 years ago and never talked about it, but I started reading your comic, and now I just like it all kind of makes sense. And I get him, and like we were able to connect on that level. So I love that stuff. But I also really love the emails that I get that are like, I've literally never even heard of the Marine Corps, but I started reading your comic and it's hilarious. And now I'm really into it for some reason, and I get those too. So, I think that focusing on humor, there's things that I try not to make Terminal Lance like too technical and too insidery. I mean, there is an insider element to it, obviously, but I think that when you present humor, like something that's funny to you is hopefully going to be funny to other people too. And in my own taste of stuff, I just figure whenever I'm making a comic strip, I think to myself, like, if this joke makes me laugh out loud, then I'm hopeful and I can assume that it's going to make other people laugh too. And whether they're civilian or military or not, that's sort of my barometer, whether something's actually funny, is if I can actually think of the joke and laugh out loud when I come up with it. And then my wife is just sitting there going, like, why is he laughing at nothing? I'm just sitting some stupid joke in my head that, I'm going to make a Terminal Lance comic.
That's good, though. You keep the relationship fresh by keeping her guessing what's going on.
Exactly, yeah. The Marines keep me fresh, too, because they send me stuff all the time.
I bet.
Messages and emails that I get.
Yeah.
Are my favorite thing about doing Terminal Lance.
When it comes to the White Donkey, I'm not going to suggest that there isn't humor in the White Donkey, but it's got some significant depth to it in terms of the issues that you grapple with. And I'm going to try to be very careful here because I want people to go out and actually read the White Donkey. So I don't want no spoiler alerts here, but right. Talk to our listeners a little bit about how you selected the main themes or the storyline. How did that come together for you? And then we'll talk about the illustrations that accompany that storyline.
Yeah. So I went through a lot with the White Donkey. I mean, I as a storyteller, the reason I joined the Marine Corps was because I wanted to be an artist that had some kind of worldliness, like, this is my 19-year-old idea of, what I needed to do as an artist. I was like, short of, so this is really funny, but I love the movie Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan film. Batman, obviously everybody knows Batman. And there's this element of it where Bruce Wayne like hops on a cargo ship and just like goes. He just leaves, and goes to explore the world and like learn ninjutsu and like all kinds of crazy stuff. And short of doing that, it was like, what can I do for myself that was going to give me some kind of understanding of the world that I wasn't getting as a 19-year-old kid in Oregon. And so, I was the right age and gender, and there was a war in Iraq going on, and I was like, you know what? I want to go to Iraq. And what's the quickest way I can go to Iraq? And that's join the Marine Corps Infantry. So that's what I did. That was essentially my mindset. And so I started coming up with the White Donkey really while I was in Iraq. I mean, that first deployment, there were things that kind of stood out to me, and I knew that I wanted to tell stories. I didn't necessarily know I was going to tell a story about that, or create terminal ants at that point, but there are always these moments that stick out to me. And the White Donkey itself, that was a real event that happened when I was in Iraq. It was one of my first patrols outside the wire, and I was in the backseat. It basically happened exactly like it happened in the book. I was in the backseat of a vehicle. We were a mounted platoon, so we had 5 vehicles traveling down Zidon Road. It was one of my first patrols outside the wire, and I remember, they tell you in the training leading up, in the workup, look out for anything suspicious in the road, look out for any kind of, craters and trash, etc. But what they don't tell you is that Iraq is like a war zone and a third world country, and there's craters and trash and stuff everywhere. And so I'm looking out the window, and I'm freaking out, internally, I'm like, I'm going to die out here. This is insane. I don't know why I decided to do this. It's a bad idea. And I remember the convoy just stopped, and nobody knew what was going on. And so my platoon commander I was in Big 2, where the platoon commander was, and he was in the seat in front of me, and he gets on the horn, and he gets on the radio, and he calls up to Vic 1. He's like, Vic 1, this is Vic 2, why'd we stop? And Vic 1 responds, this is my section leader, Corporal Albrecht, who's actually in the book, there's a donkey in the road. And I was just like, what does that mean, So I was a dismount at the time, and so I got out of the truck, and I remember looking down the road to the front of the convoy, and there was a donkey in the road. There was a white donkey. And it stood out to me because I'd never seen a white donkey. It was also 120 degrees outside. This could have just been some kind of fever dream or something. I don't know. Kind of like heat stroke I was having. But I remember looking at the front of the convoy and seeing this donkey, and it wasn't stuck in the road. It wasn't crossing the road or anything like that. It was walking dead center in the road in the same direction that we were going, as if it was leading us. And that image just emblazoned into my psyche, and I could not stop thinking about it. Much like in the White Donkey, this idea, this image just plagued me. It was I could not stop thinking about this thing. It stood out to me because, here we are, 5 vehicles, 5 trucks, Marines, 25 Marines in the platoon, every weapon you could possibly imagine. We got machine guns, we got grenades, we got grenade launchers, we got everything you could want. All the power and might of the United States military brought to a screeching halt by the most benign animal ever. This ass made us all kind of look like an ass, And there was something really powerful about that to me, and it just sort of stuck with me. And when I got out of the Marine Corps, this story was sort of cooking in the back of my head, in early 2010, 2011. Well, I did Kickstarter in 2013, but the story had been kind of bubbling, and that really became the central theme of the story, grounding everything that went around it, was this white donkey, this event, and that really became the theme of the entire book. So much so, I originally didn't plan on calling the book The White Donkey. I just was going to call it Terminal Ants, the graphic novel, or whatever. But it became such a powerful part of the book and of the story that it just took over the whole thing. And I was like, this is what the story is about. And so that became the title, and it was so much so that it became the title of the book. And yeah, so there's obviously that experience of the White Donkey. The whole story as a whole is really a lot about coming of age and expectations versus reality, and trauma, and all these themes kind of work together. And as you said, humor. I find that put Marines in any room together, there's going to be humor at some point. So it's impossible to write Marines without humor, because they're the funniest people on the planet. So all those things, as I thought about encapsulating my experience in Iraq and in the Marine Corps, because it's such a crazy experience to go through. For me, the White Donkey was really getting at the core of, pun intended, of what it meant. As a sort of prominent figure in the veteran space or in the military space, or whatever you want to call it, I'd seen people put out books of memoir stars and their kind of experiences or whatever. But for me, I wasn't as interested in that as much as I was really boiling it down to the meaning and what was the point, what was the purpose, and what did I get out of that? Like, if I could distill my entire Marine Corps experience down into one thing, one thesis, like, what was it? And so that's what the White Donkey ended up being. And that's why I fictionalized it as well, because it allowed me to work with it in a way that you obviously can't do with nonfiction, because it's all reality. And sometimes reality does not give us the literary elements that we need to tell a story.
Right. Well, and you certainly, the novel has some incredibly deep themes. I mean, you deal with PTSD, you deal with alcoholism, mental health issues, suicide. Fictionalizing the story, I think, probably allows you a little bit of that emotional standoff, so you could dig more deeply into those issues than perhaps if you were dealing with actual names of actual people, even though, as you've identified, some of this was inspired by actual names and actual people. But how do you think the graphic nature of the White Donkey also helps you grapple with some of these more challenging issues in a way that we don't get out of public service discussions or service-wide mental health conversations or conversations about suicide? Is there anything, because this is a real challenge for the Marine Corps, is there anything through using fiction or using a graphic novel or visual arts that help us as humans grapple with these more challenging issues on a deeper, maybe more therapeutic level?
I think so. I think people are very visual in general. I think that humans are very visual. I think that we see things, we see a face, and we immediately know what that person is feeling. You know, like we know what people are thinking and feeling just by looking at them. And so there's a lot of emotion and weight in imagery. And I also, I like to make comics for Marines because I know they don't read very well. And
no crayon jokes here.
I know this is supposed to be a very serious discussion. I think there's something about the imagery that makes it more accessible in a way. Like when you pick up a novel, you pick up a book, you know you're getting a bunch of words. You're getting something from the author that is their own ability to string together sentences and get their point across. But when you pick up a comic or a movie or anything visual, there's so much that's just implied and so much that you don't need to. It's not about creating literary prose. It's not about beautiful writing. It's about getting information across in a way that's immediate and accessible and is relatable too. I mean, you see characters and you feel like these are people, like these are real, people that are living in the story, and you're part of this now. Now you're watching it. So I think it's a different kind of mental grappling that people have when they read comics or watch a movie versus reading a book. I think also because books, literary books, like novels, are so open to interpretation in a sense. Like that you're imagining all the characters, right? Like you come up with your own version of characters. Whereas in a movie or a graphic novel or a comic, you're being shown what it is. Like it's made for you. Like it's put in front of you, so you don't really get a say in the matter. So there's information being given to you. It's not necessarily open to interpretation in the same way that like the novel is. So I think there's sort of a different way that we interpret what we see versus what we read. And I think that novels can be kind of intimidating sometimes for people that don't read a lot of them. And, there's like book people and there's like not book people. Mm-hmm. And so I think a graphic novel is a great kind of middle ground where it's like, here's something that is a book, but it's very visual and it's accessible. And it can reach, I think, a wider group of people that maybe won't be inclined to pick up another novel. And it's also like, and this isn't to discount the work of anybody else, obviously, but, there's a lot of books out there. And so I think that The White Donkey kind of stands out as being this, like, this is different. Like, this is a different thing. So you may be more inclined to see it and think, oh, this is really unique. I'm going to take a look at this, And ultimately, when I'm trying to get a story across to people that I want to resonate with them, I want them to pick it up. I want them to pick it up and look at it and give it a shot. So, I think being able to reach a wider group helps the White Donkey in that sense.
Mm-hmm. What was the hardest part of writing the White Donkey?
The whole thing was hard. I think
life.
Life. I mean, that's the thing. Like, the White Donkey it's a book that terrifies me in a way that it's hard to explain as the creator of it. It's hard for me to even open up the book and look at it, my own thing. Like, I've created this monster in a way that it's like, I'm terrified of even opening it up and looking at it. Because to me, it forces me to relive a lot of it. And relive not just the experiences of those 4 years of my life, but of writing it was a kind of traumatic thing to do, to sit down and actually like pour all that soul into that book. Was an experience. So that, I think, was the most challenging part of writing it. But then, you get into the story structure and all that kind of stuff, and that's more, straightforward stuff to talk about. But,
well, thank you for coming on the podcast and reliving a painful part of your life. We appreciate your sacrifice.
Thank you. I mean, I think, like, if we want to have, like, an open discussion about story structure, I mean, that's all stuff that's really important, too. And it's funny because people ask me, like, what other books have you read that inspired the White Donkey? And I'm like, none. Like, not a single book that I have read is applicable to the White Donkey. It doesn't, like, none of that stuff matters. Because all that stuff, like, and people think that because I am a New York Times bestselling military author, right, that I've read a bunch of military books. And I'm like, I did not read a single Tom Clancy book or whatever to inspire me to write the White Donkey. That just didn't happen. And so when I think of story, to me, the White Donkey is a exercise in storytelling craft, as much as it is in visual craft of creating art and drawing and painting. There's a craft involved of story craft. You have information that you need to get across to the reader, and you need to present it in a way that they interpret it the way you want them to at the right time and moment. Because you're trying to get the audience to feel a certain emotion at that moment. Because those emotions guide them through the rest of the story. And ultimately, what I keep in mind at all times is the reader and their emotions as they're reading anything that I write. Because that's ultimately the most important part. So when I think of things that inspired me when I made The White Donkey, I looked at Jurassic Park, the movie. Which may be a weird answer, but that's the movie that I broke down, and I looked at the screenplay, and I was like, this is a perfect story as it's told, as far as storytelling craft goes, of getting across characters and themes and story structure. And so I broke that movie down, and I said, how is this movie made, and how is this movie told? And that was a bigger inspiration to me making The White Donkey than any military work, which sounds really weird, but that's how I approach story craft. Like, to me, the subject is kind of irrelevant to the storytelling of how you get that information across to people. Because I know the story I want to tell. I don't need other people's inspiration to tell it, and that's how I approach it, at least. So other people obviously have their own ways of going about this stuff. But I think of it really in terms of craft of, like, how do I tell a story? I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
it does. Well, and it segues into the next question that I want to ask you. I'm going to quote you back to you, which is always a little fraught, so apologies in advance for that. But you have recently written that Marines, for as bullheaded and invincible as they might see themselves, they are first and foremost human. It is interesting to me, and I think to a lot of the readers, that one of the main themes in The White Donkey is that you don't see the enemy. And for a graphic novel that is visual, inherently visual, that's got to be really hard to write a storyline with a visual depiction where the enemy is absent from the main medium, right? And so talk to us a little bit about how you pulled that off, about how you grappled with that, how that connects to this idea that Marines might be tough. And I have said a couple of times that you can kill a Marine, but you'll never stop them. But how do we get at when the enemy is invisible, when we can't see it, when it perhaps might even be internal, how do we grapple with that? How do we move forward from that?
Yeah, Marines being human first, I think, is the central thesis of literally all of my work with Terminal X. I mean, that's sort of what it's all about. I mean, that's how you make a comic about Marines, is understanding that the people and they have the same thoughts and feelings and stuff. I think a lot of military writers or people on the outside who were not enlisted and write military movies or whatever, that's the fundamental thing that they miss, is like they write it from a place of exceptionality. So they put it on a pedestal and they write it from the outside looking in. Whereas myself, I write Marines from the inside looking out, and so I write them from a place of normality. Mm-hmm. So to me, when I write a Marine, that's a base level, right? It's not an exceptional thing. Like, that's the starting point. So the rest is, what do they do as people? Like, what do they do as human? And as far as the enemy and the white donkey goes, I mean, that was a big part of the theme of the book, was this is a story about war that's not really about a war. It's not really about the war. You know, it's about this Marine's internal war with himself. And so, you know, the enemy would have just distracted from the whole story. Like, it would have made, like, the whole story. And you only have so much time and space to say anything in a script or in a book. So you have these, like, moments, these chunks of time that you're dealing with when you write a script. And it's like, what can you get across in that? Does it serve the larger purpose of the story? So it's like, could I have put, you know, some scene in the book where you do get to see the enemy? Like, I guess, but it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered for the larger scope of what the story is about and what the point of the story was. It also, again, as you said, like, this book is about this invisible enemy of the self and of, you know, PTSD and these other specters that we can't really visualize. So I think that putting an overtly, you know, literal enemy in the book would have been really a mistake. And I think that the enemy, like, it's always this ghostly kind of specter. And that's actually reflective of how my experience in Iraq was. It was like, we never knew what the enemy really looked like or really was. It was like, we were there. There was an insurgency and there were, you know, terrorists, and that's all we knew. And it's like, what do they look like? They look like everybody else. There was no uniformed enemy team. You know, that's not the nature of this war. So not depicting the enemy in the White Donkey really speaks to the larger themes of not just Abe's journey in the story, but of the war in Iraq itself. I mean, that was really a big point, was that was there really an enemy? Like, was there anything? Like, what was it? Like, it was just such a weird experience to never see the enemy team and to never, like, know who it was going to be or what it was, you know?
I have a suspicion that when you wrote The White Donkey, you did not anticipate that 4 mere years later, you would find yourself on the Commandant's professional reading list. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I got a hunch that that's true. What does it mean to you that you've been selected for the Commandant's reading list?
I think it's really great. I mean, you know, The White Donkey is obviously part of the Terminal Lance lexicon. It's part of that universe of stuff. And I think that it speaks to the impact that Terminal Lance and myself have had on the Marine Corps at large. And, you know, starting from the bottom, now we're here. Like, I started as a Lance Corporal, getting out as a Terminal Lance, which is a true story. And I got out of the Marine Corps as a Lance Corporal. And here we are now, talking about, you know, a Terminal Lance book on the Commandant's reading list. And I think it just, you know, it feels really great to know that the work has resonated with the people that it was intended for, which is the Lance Corporals of the Marine Corps, the Marines of the Marine Corps, you know, to know that they are appreciating the work in the way that it was meant to be, and that it means that much to them, that they would put it on that list, say this is something that all Marines should read. You know, it feels great. It's really good. It's amazing. I love it. Yeah, it's cool. It's really, it feels like it's kind of come full circle in a way from, you know, me leaving the Marine Corps and starting Terminal Lance to 10 years later, and boom, now, you know, we're talking about me being on the Commandant's reading list and my work being on the reading list for all Marines recommended reading. So it's really cool. It feels good.
So you are now out of uniform. There are no more fit reps. There are no more promotion requirements. So you can speak freely and tell the Commandant what he ought to do. You are the first graphic novel on the Commandant's reading list, a pretty notable accomplishment from what historically has been more history or political science or more technical military I don't want to say doctrine, because that tends not to be on the reading list, but more formal military works. How else do you think the reading list should evolve over time to keep up with Marines' professional development needs in 2020, moving forward for the next decade?
It's hard for me to say. I think that Marines and the military in general, at large, they tend to be very literal about stuff. So it's like, here's a book about readiness, and whatever. It's like it's some very literal idea of like what we want Marines to learn. But with the White Donkey, I didn't approach it like that. It wasn't like the literal didn't really matter. It was what did I want? What was the bigger picture? Like what did I want people to take away from this book and see it and learn from it or get from it? And so it's sort of like I don't know. It's identifying, I guess, works of literature, or I would say even movies. I think movies could be on the reading list. I think Marines would be a lot more likely to watch them too.
Yeah.
Because again, they don't read very well. I think that any work that inspires emotional strength and emotional virtues that we want Marines to have or to learn from, I think is what we should be looking at. I think that the literal doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. The literal of like, this book is really great for, officer planning of sieges on cities. Like, I don't know. I'm spitballing here. But like the very literal stuff, like all that stuff is very arbitrary and dumb. What really matters is the emotional takeaway from something and what people can gain from it. What does it add to their character as a person? What soul-enriching experience can we give people to take away and be better people at the end of the day? And that I think is where the focus should really be on, less on the literal and more on the emotional takeaway of something. At least that's how I view it. And I think that as far as a reading list goes, I think it's really awesome that it has expanded to include a graphic novel. I think there's also a lot of great movies, documentaries, about great stories that are inspiring. I think there's all kinds of room for interpretation on what it means. What should be recommended for Marines to watch and read and look at. Even video games, I could say. There's a lot of interactive stuff. I'm a big gamer, so games, the landscape of those things have changed too. So I just think it's about identifying media that can inform the character of Marines and make them better people, or at least try to, or try to instill some kind of virtue of what to take away from it.
So I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything in the pipeline that you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, actually.
Great.
By the time this airs, it will already be out. But I'm not going to say anything about it right now. But we do have an exciting animated thing coming out very soon. So that'll be a lot of fun. And there's also a new graphic novel, Battleborn, Lapis Lazuli, which just came out a couple of months ago. And that is a 352-page graphic novel.
Wow.
Written and illustrated by yours truly, about Marines in Afghanistan, about Sergeant King in Afghanistan and taking the fight for the Taliban around the gemstone trade. So definitely check that out. If you like the White Donkey, you will probably also like Battleborn. It's a much different kind of vibe and a different story, but it is another story by yours truly about Marines abroad. So check it out.
Fantastic. And I'm excited to see what happens with this animated surprise that's coming soon. That'll be great too.
Coming very soon. I hope people like it.
So last question, and this is a standard question we ask everyone who comes on the podcast, and that is, what are you reading right now that our listeners should know about? And of course, you can interpret reading more broadly to include video or audio, other media.
Yeah. Gosh, what am I reading right now? I've been working so much. I haven't really had a lot of time to be reading. But I do. Cyberpunk just came out. I've been playing that. It's a video game. That's been a big deal. It's actually really cool. It's a cool, medium. I mean, there's a lot of, storytelling and world building and stuff going on in there. And I've been really impressed by games lately. I played Death Stranding. It was, one of the most interesting pieces of fiction that I've seen. It's another video game in a very long time. You should check that out. It's a really interesting world building kind of thing. But yeah, I am not currently actively reading anything. I should probably be, though.
Well, there's an entire reading list you could draw from.
There is. I should check those other books out.
So, Max, thank you so much for coming on the show. You can follow Terminal Lance on Twitter and Facebook and probably other social media platforms that I'm not going to talk about right now. But to keep up with the good work of Marine Corps University, follow us on social media at Marine Corps U. Special thanks to our intrepid producer, Jen Patcha Howell. I'm your host, Becky Johnson. Thank you for listening to Eagles, Globes, and Anchors, the strategically minded, innovative podcast of Marine Corps University.
This concludes the EGA podcast. Thank you for joining us. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the United States Marine Corps or the Department of Defense. You can follow the Marine Corps War College on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at McWar College. And as always, our podcast music is Stuck in Traffic by Ribeiro. Have a great day.